I am Amelia Vance from Future Privacy Forum and have Kelsey Finch, who runs our de-identification program specifically at SPS with us as well.
Hey folks, thanks all for joining us today.
So Kelsey and I are very thrilled that as opposed to us taking over the call, as we often do, today we have a fantastic moderator and all-around everything explainer in the form of Michael Hawes, who is the director of the Privacy Technical Assistance Center at the U.S. Department of Ed. So Michael, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and have you take over the rest of our introductions.
Great. Thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Kelsey. So good afternoon, everyone. I know the best moderators are those that get things rolling really quickly and then get out of the way. So I'm going to save most of my work here to be moderating the questions. And I believe Amelia is going to share a link to the Google document to submit your questions for our presenters today.
Yes, it will be in the chat box.
Perfect, perfect. So check out the chat box and definitely submit your questions, and I'll be selecting some good ones to present to our distinguished panelists today. So our first presentation is by a very distinguished trio from Boston University who are going to explain the basics of secure multi-party computation, which is something that we've heard mention of a lot in policy circles over the last couple of years. It's being billed as something with tremendous potential for solving many of the privacy issues that federal agencies and many organizations at the state and local level have been facing when trying to protect privacy while exchanging data between organizations. So they're going to explain the basics of secure multi-party computation and then discuss some recent deployments and implementations of MPC that they've been involved in, particularly the work they've done with the Boston Women's Workforce Council. Our presenters today are Andrei Lapets, who is an associate professor of the practice in computer science and director of research development at the Hariri Institute at Boston University. Andrei applies his background in formal methods and programming languages research, as well as his industry experience, to the challenges of deploying novel cryptographic technologies in real-world scenarios. Also, Mayank Varis is a research associate professor at Boston University in their computer science department, specializing in cryptography. And Frederick Jansen is a senior software engineer at the Software and Application Innovation Lab at Boston University. He designs, develops, and manages software development projects in support of computational research efforts and provides consulting services to faculty and researchers who are seeking professional software development support. So with that, I will turn things over to our first presenters here. And please put your questions that you may have into the Google documents, and I will be selecting from those at the end of the webinar today.
I believe we are unmuted.
Yes, you are.
Perfect, thank you. So first of all, thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk here today about multi-party computation and our efforts involving that technology. So the talk is split into three major parts. At first, I'll be giving a brief overview of our motivation to be involved in this space and a little bit of the history of how we became involved. Next, Andrei will talk about, actually Mayank will talk about MPC for private data analysis and give a high-level overview of what MPC does and what it's capable of doing. And finally, Andrei will finish with the applications of MPC and how we deployed it specifically for the Boston Women's Workforce Council. So first, a little bit of history.
Inserting really quickly, only part of the slides are currently visible.
Okay. We could present this way if that helps. Is this better?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
So a little bit of history. The year is 2013. We're in Boston, and the former mayor, Tom Menino, comes up with a pledge to make Boston the premier city for working women. And in order to do so, the main goal is really to close the gender wage gap that has existed and unfortunately still exists in this economy. So specifically what he does, he starts the Women's Workforce Council, which is comprised of industry leaders in businesses as well as social advocates in academia and politics. And the Workforce Council establishes a pledge, which is called the 100% talent. And a lot of companies sign on to this. To date, there are more than 200 companies that signed the pledge. Specifically, what the pledge aims to do, or what the action plan is of the pledge, is three things. First, we want to understand the root cause of the gender wage gap. Second, we want to use evidence-based methods to close the wage gap. And lastly, and this is the part that we have been most interested in, is measuring the progress over time. Now, obviously, if you want to measure progress in this area, you need to be able to collect data. And the data that we're talking about here is salary data of, some very large employers within the greater Boston area. So part of the goals of the, and I'm going to quote directly from the 100 Talent Compact here, employers agree to contribute data to a report compiled by a third party on the compact success to date. Employer level data would not be identified in the report. So when I'm reading this, I immediately feel that there's some friction between, compiling data that does not identify employer level data, but still they have to submit this data to a, hopefully trusted third party, which, it just feels like there are a lot of things that can go wrong here. So in a traditional approach, the way something like this would work is company A takes their salary data, they submit it to the trusted third party, company B does the same thing, all of the other companies likewise follow the same approach. The trusted third party compiles all of this data, computes the analytics, in this case, simple aggregation, and then provides the aggregated result to the Boston Women's Workforce Council so that they can write the report. Now, there are a lot of things that could go wrong with this approach. First of all, the trusted third party has to be trusted to not do anything malicious with the data, like sell it to another party. But even if everyone trusts this company and they have the best of interests for everyone, the data might still be vulnerable when it is submitted or when it's stored or when the analysis is actually computed. And the third party itself now also becomes a target for hackers potentially, because instead of having to hack 200 companies to get their salary data, now you only have to hack the one that compiles all of this data together. And it's really that last thing that caused this effort to fail initially, because the third party that was identified to help with this, their lawyers came back at the end and said, sorry, we don't feel comfortable storing all of this data because it's a major liability for us. If we lose the data, if we get hacked, now all of a sudden we have 200 companies that could be suing us, and all of their employees could also be suing us for breaching their privacy. So they were not on board with this plan. And maybe as a short aside, since this is in the topic of the identification, actually straight up the identification would not work in this case, because if we assume that company A would be Microsoft, for example, and they submit their data anonymized, coded, everything done properly to the trusted third party, it's trivial to re-identify the company because it's a publicly traded company. We know how many employees they have. We know how much they spend on salary. So just looking at the data would make it really trivial to identify who Microsoft is, even in a larger data set. So really what we're looking for is an alternative solution where the data, and this is not a JPEG artifact, that actually the idea behind it is that the data that is used for the computation is not submitted in any sort of legible way, or is not used in any sort of legible way, or does not even leave the company's premises in a legible way, while still allowing some form of secure and private computation to happen in this theoretical, well, right now theoretical, but hopefully soon practical model that Mayank will continue talking about.
Okay, thanks, Frederick. So so I want to talk about how we can engineer a new workflow, something new to put into that cloud bubble that will allow us to achieve the public good that we want, in our example, to be able to compute, to measure the wage gap, but without ever revealing any data in the clear. So we want to be able to compute over data that we cannot see, so that we can get a result that is public, but in such a way that the constituent pieces of data always remain private. So I'm going to describe sort of the concept of how a tool from cryptography called Secure Multi-Party Computation, often abbreviated MPC, can solve this problem, can achieve the workflow that was desired of the Workforce Council, and then Andrei will show specifically how we built a system for them to use. So the underlying idea of secure multi-party computation is that everybody who has data, rather than giving it to one trusted third party, instead should provide something to multiple computing parties. So the participants on the left side, the hospital here, can provide data to more than one intermediate step inside this green box. So at first, this sounds strange, because if we didn't want to trust one party with our data, why are we trusting two? But the answer is that we don't actually give our raw data to anybody. We instead encode the data, we split it in a specific sort of way, so that we give pieces of information to both of these outsourced computing entities in such a way, and this encoding scheme has some special properties that any one of the computing parties on their own, seeing just one encoding, one share, one piece of the encoding, does not learn anything about what your data is, but together they know enough information about your data that they could reconstruct it if they wanted, but even better, they can actually do computations over that data and then only reconstruct the answer to some sort of question that they have in mind. So somehow collectively they can do any kind of computing over data they cannot read, and they can only open up the answer that comes at the end of the process. And this opening requires all of these computing parties to be involved. And what that means from the point of view of a contributing organization who gives data is that as long as you trust just one of the computing parties in the middle, your data is safe, it's protected, the privacy is protected, as long as there's just one computing party that you trust in the middle. So secure multi-party computation is aimed to protect the question of how do you compute some sort of statistical analysis in a safe manner, so that the act of doing the computation never requires you to see information in the clear. But presumably the answer to whatever statistical analysis you're computing is then going to be revealed to somebody. And MPC says nothing about the results of the computation. The risks of publishing any sort of metric about your data are the same with or without secure multi-party computation. Indeed, secure multi-party computation is independent and complementary to any sort of technology that you might want to use to protect the result of the computation, such as de-identification techniques or differential privacy, for instance. So secure multi-party computation protects how you calculate an answer, and de-identification and differential privacy protect what information you reveal to everybody. The benefit of using MPC together with techniques like de-identification or differential privacy is that you can achieve better accuracy because, while you do the computation, you can do computation over not yet de-identified data, and only de-identify the data at the very end of your workflow. By contrast, sometimes if you try to de-identify data at the very beginning of your workflow, you might not actually have enough interesting information to reconstitute what the metrics that are of interest to you. So in an example here, if you want to do some sort of longitudinal analysis where you track a patient over time, say at multiple hospitals, and what you want to do as a result is to do a join operation by the patient identifier. In MPC, you can do all of this calculation over the raw data, except the encoded version of the raw data that you cannot see. But in the machinery of MPC, you can calculate this. Whereas if you de-identified on an individual hospital level the data before you tried to do a joint operation, well, you've just stripped out the piece of information that was needed in order to produce the calculation, in order to do the longitudinal analysis. Another benefit of secure multi-party computation, or another kind of workflow that you could enable, is to figure out whether some sort of calculation is even worth doing. If you have some very complicated and sophisticated calculation that involves sensitive data, what you could first do is run a secure multi-party computation just to see if the answer to a joint analysis would even be useful to you before you go through any process of any more sophisticated data sharing between organizations. You could simply compute the answer to the question, would the resulting data be of use to us? And if not, then you may not need to release anything whatsoever. You can simply stop. So in this sense, if the answer was never going to provide you with any value, then there's no need to do even techniques like de-identification, which may still reveal something about your individual sensitive inputs. If the answer wasn't going to be useful, you might as well stop and not even output anything of value. So that's the short description of how MPC works, that it protects how to go about computing things in such a way that no one can see what's going on until the very end. So this idea of secure multi-party computation has been studied in the academic literature for about 35 years now. Over the past decade, there have been a variety of deployments of this technology. Our work collaborating with the City of Boston and the Boston Women's Workforce Council is the first sustained endeavor to actually deploy this technology within the US public sector. And I'll turn it over to Andrei to describe more about our work there.
Thanks, Mayank. So let me get to the next slide here. So we decided, as you might recall, we ran into a challenge where there was a roadblock and we could not move forward without potentially a trusted third party. We instead introduced the possibility of using MPC to resolve this issue, and we created a web application that allowed, at this point, over 100 different organizations on 3 occasions during 3 MPC sessions to collaboratively analyze their information. And I'll get a little bit into the details of what that information is. But basically, they were able to use this web application to do the analysis. And now for 2 of those analyses, a report has been published in 2016 and now, actually for 2016. And now in January, this January, a report was published for the data from 2017 that actually provides the result of that aggregate analysis. And as you can see, it's actually, it is a representative, large sample of the workforce, and represents a large amount of the total annual earnings that individuals earned during those years. So the application itself that was constructed had a very familiar interface, and basically, as I'll mention later, this is an important element of deploying these kinds of applications. It had an interface that reflected data that some of the companies were already collecting, and the format sort of matched things that they were already collecting internally. And the other aspect of our architecture is that we did hide the details of the MPC implementation from most of the data contributors. From their perspective, they were using a standard web application without any special features. The individual sort of fields within the data set here were organized around these sorts of rows and columns. And if you've seen the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's format for reporting data, this actually matches the EEO1 worksheet that companies submit currently. The only difference is the Boston Women's Workforce Council expanded it to also include compensation and different forms of compensation as well, including things like bonuses. So effectively, if we look at the traditional workflow, what would have had to happen without MPC is that the individual organizations could fill out their EEO-1C forms and basically submit them in the clear or through some kind of end-to-end encryption and delivered it to the Boston Women's Workforce Council. Then the Boston Women's Workforce Council could add up the spreadsheets and get what they wanted, which is the total aggregate spending for each of those categories. So level of seniority, gender, and ethnicity across the workforce that was represented by these employer organizations. As we mentioned, this was not an acceptable solution to either the Boston Women's Workforce Council or any third party that would act as an intermediary. So we adapted a protocol from actually the 1980s, and it's a very simple protocol that can be used to implement a form of multi-party computation. And I'm going to describe that very briefly here, just so we get an idea of what it looks like. And this is, of course, a caricature of how this works, but hopefully it gives us some idea of how these protocols work. I should also preface this by saying there are many much more sophisticated protocols, and any computation is possible to do under MPC, although it could be costly. So here we'll begin with two organizations on the left-hand side that perhaps want to allow the Boston Women's Workforce Council to compute the totals that the total of the numbers that they possess, but they don't want to reveal their individual numbers to either Boston University or, in this case, the Boston Women's Workforce Council. So one thing that an organization can do, such as the one on the top left, is it can take the true value that they wish to preserve and keep private, and they can split it into two values. One is going to be a lie, and they're going to deliver that lie to, in this case, I believe, Boston University. And the other number will be the discrepancy, which is the difference between the truth and that lie. So we can see that that's what the top left organization has done in delivering this data to Boston University and the Boston Women's Workforce Council. So the other organization can also do the same thing. They can deliver to Boston University a lie about what their true value is, and they can deliver the discrepancy to the Boston Women's Workforce Council. Then each organization, in this case, for example, Boston University, they can add up, in this case, Boston University is adding up the lies and sending over the total of the lies to the Boston Women's Workforce Council. Then internally, the Boston Women's Workforce Council can go ahead and add up the discrepancies and subtract them out, and then they will get the total of the two numbers. So you'll notice in this process that, each of those cells within those spreadsheets could be delivered in this way, in this sort of split fashion to the two parties. For each of those cells, Boston University can add up the totals of the lies. They can deliver those totals to the Boston Women's Workforce Council. Those would be subtracted out from the discrepancies, and the Boston Women's Workforce Council would get the true numbers, which represent the totals of each cell across all of the organizations. So we ran into a large number of issues when deploying even this simple protocol, and we've learned a lot about the barriers and the challenges that one faces when deploying MPC. One of the challenges is actually a usability or accessibility challenge, and it actually manifests itself in many different forms. One usability challenge is that, as I mentioned before, the users who actually use the application that has MPC under the hood should ideally be should not be burdened with understanding how the protocol works, and should not be burdened with additional responsibilities, like, for example, storing private keys and so on. So we actually built the application to look familiar and simple. So it's just a web application. You go to the website, it looks like a spreadsheet, you paste in your data, you click a submit button, and that's your sole responsibility as a data contributor. The other thing that, of course, is important is that the information that's submitted is accurate. And this is actually a challenge with MPC, because as you might recall, the party that receives the result, in this case, the Boston Women's Workforce Council, they cannot go back and fix mistakes of individual contributors because they don't have that information. In fact, nobody does. So a single mistake by a single party where, for example, they submit a value that is orders of magnitude off from what it actually is, may taint the entire result. So in this case, we were taking the sums of individual cells across all the organizations. An individual cell in the final outcome may very well be completely wrong if one of the parties, just one, submitted an incorrect value, even erroneously. So it's extremely important to make sure that the application allows, at the client side, at the point at which data is being contributed, allows some kind of feedback to ensure or at least to reduce the possibility that someone submits data that is incorrect. Of course, the application should run in a standard environment. So one of the things we faced is we cannot ask hundreds of companies to install custom applications on their desktop machines behind their firewalls. This would have been a complete non-starter. So we did have to make sure that the application was a simple browser application that anybody can load as long as they go to Google. They can go to Google and do a Google search. They can load the application and participate. And of course, the source code of the application ideally can be audited and reviewed by others to ensure that it functions as intended. So the solution that we built was in fact open source. So basically, our experience with this limited scenario where we took a fairly straightforward and easy to explain protocol and implemented an application around it, and we're able to deploy it on 3 occasions now over 3 years, demonstrates that MPC is ready for deployment in at least these sorts of limited scenarios. However, it is true also that today, at least, to implement any particular application for any particular scenario, you will still need involvement from domain experts who are actually going to be able to talk about, what are the unique aspects of the analysis that are important, what are the aspects that are perhaps possible to modify to accommodate the protocol, and you also will need engagement from the cryptography experts to actually custom build a protocol. And there are groups, both ours and others around the world, that are currently able to do that for these kinds of custom scenarios. And our experience demonstrates that it is possible for something at least of this scale. So we're talking about small to medium data and in a situation where you can build a web application that allows users to submit. And we're talking about statistical analyses that are not too sophisticated. So, your standard statistical analyses like aggregation, standard deviation, linear regression, these are the things that are currently possible to do without a high computation cost. As I said, in general, any computation is possible, but it could be costly both in terms of communication and computation to do those. And of course, it would require, at least today, a lot of custom work. So just to summarize briefly, secure multi-party computation allows parties to compute over data that they cannot see and that they don't need to see to perform that computation. Any analysis is possible under MPC, but potentially the cost could be higher. Currently, today, both in terms of development and in terms of actually performing the computation when it's actually required. It can protect sensitive inputs and intermediate values, but it cannot protect the output. The output comes back just as it would from any other computation. But it is independent and complementary with existing techniques like de-identification. So you could certainly do de-identification under MPC, as we've shown in the earlier examples. So kind of takeaways are that we can, sorry, someone switched over. Should I continue?
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, so basically, sorry, I just got lost because of the slide here. Yeah, and again, just the final takeaway is that you can eliminate the need to centralize trust and centralize storage of data within a particular organization. MPC is useful for those kinds of mitigation strategies. So yeah, thank you very much, and we look forward to answering any questions about either our experience with MPC or any other technical details about MPC in general.
Thank you, gentlemen. So we are going to save the majority of questions for the end of the webinar, but I do want to just ask one or two right now, based largely off of the input that we got via the Google document. If you haven't submitted your questions yet, please add those in there. So question, you mentioned on several occasions that any computation is feasible under MPC. The example you gave was a fairly straightforward one involving just aggregation of tabular data. Like how scalable, like how feasible would implementation of an MPC framework be for an organization that wants to use this for more sophisticated statistical analysis? And do you need to be able to predict in advance all of the types of analysis that would be performed, or can you have a framework of MPC that permits kind of a wide spectrum?
So I'll try to answer all three parts of that question, although others might jump in. So in terms of scalability, it is technically feasible, but it may be expensive to compute, to perform computations over large data sets. And right now, certainly, organizations would have to custom build or introduce new applications into their infrastructure. So, new tools or new services that will allow sort of large-scale computation. Not of the example, the example we gave was just a browser-based application. Obviously, if you have databases or something like that, you would need to custom build solutions and introduce them into the workflow. So that's both a software engineering effort and a deployment effort. In terms of the sophistication of the techniques that can be used. So again, today, it is certainly feasible to do things like linear regressions without too much cost. To do more sophisticated kinds of analyses could potentially be prohibitively expensive today. And the final part of the question, yes, it is a challenge of MPC that you must define your analyses in advance. So you need to decide what are the analyses that you want to run, and then you're going to get the result from those whether you like it or not, right? You're not going to be able to go back and look through the data and do a different kind of analysis. So you kind of have to plan your workflow out in advance. As we mentioned, you can actually do multiple analyses in sequence depending on which one you find most useful. So that is certainly possible under MPC, but again, you need to plan that out in advance to decide what are the different options and what are the conditions under which I'm willing to accept or reveal the result of each of those options. I don't know if anyone else has comments.
I'll just add one sentence to that last part, which is that the having to decide on the computation, the calculation in advance. I mean, to some extent, you can think of this as a feature rather than a bug, in the sense that the calculation needs to be specified in advance, and then people with data can see it and then decide whether they want to contribute their data towards such a calculation. So it's important that it's specified for privacy reasons, that people can decide whether it's something they're willing to be a part of.
Great, thank you. And one more really quick one before we move on. So you were mentioning that doing more sophisticated work here, more sophisticated analyses would be more costly. Are those costs in the form of customization of the underlying coding, or in terms of computing power, or both?
So currently, with the current state of the technology, it's both, because you would need to build custom solutions that allow more sophisticated analyses, as well as analyses that scale to larger data sets. However, you can certainly imagine, in 3 to 4 years, there would be many vendors on the market that would produce general purpose infrastructures that could be used for enabling MPC computations. And in that kind of environment, you would no longer need to do the customization, but of course you would still need to figure out, what the analyses you want to run are, and whether or not they are going to have a high communication cost. So you notice that when there are multiple parties, they do have to all communicate with one another. So there is potentially, if there's 100 or 1,000 parties all engaging in an MPC protocol, that communication overhead could be significant and sometimes even prohibitive, even if you have a sort of a turnkey solution available. So yeah, that's basically the answer.
Great. We have a whole lot more questions for you, but I want to make sure we save plenty of time for our second presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Laura Berntsen, who will be presenting on some efforts to bring privacy-enhancing technologies to public policy, particularly in the context of higher education data. Laura Berntsen is a domestic policy advisor for the Senate Finance Committee Minority for Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon. And her issue portfolio includes human services, education, and workforce development. Laura, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to join in this, and I am so glad the team from Boston University presented before me, so that I am not expected to answer any of the questions that come up on the technology itself. So I thought it'd be helpful. I realize this may be repetitive and very low level for some folks on this presentation, but I thought it'd be helpful to just briefly start with an overview of higher education data and sort of where the conversation stands right now. So most higher education outcomes are reported through the integrated post-secondary education data system right now, which is a data system at the Department of Education, and it's based on surveys of institutions across the country. And those surveys are inclusive just of first-time, full-time students, which represent less than 50% of the student population now. As time goes on, obviously non-traditional students have become the traditional students, and so our higher ed data really loses a large swath of the student population, which has implications for data accuracy, obviously. And the IPED surveys calculate things like graduation rates and highest credential receives, a couple of different calculations of graduation rates, and more recently has added information comparing graduation rates of Pell students, for example, to serve as a proxy for sort of economic related metrics. But again, those comparisons are solely first-time, full-time students. And so, you know, incomplete at best is often how the IPED surveys are described. And something to sort of put a face on this, there was a collaboration of New England institutions that wanted to get together and talk about graduation rate data. And one of the institutions had a graduation rate of 14% that was based on 7 students in a class. And another institution had a 9% IPEDS graduation rate that reflected only 11 students, which was just 5% of the 209 students in that cohort. So this is data that's coming out that really does not paint a complete picture. IPEDS data also doesn't paint any picture of what happens to students after they leave a campus. So did they find a job? At what earnings level did they find a job? Did they go on to complete another form of higher education, such as did they transfer? Did they go get a post-baccalaureate degree? We don't know any of that because of the IPEDS data limitations. So another thing that a better system could do, and I think a better system would be one that captured individual student data to allow for the capture of the intricacies of what happens to students. So obviously not at an individual level, but did a student or did an institution successfully move a student to be transferred? Did they move them into the job market? At what rate did they graduate? Those types of questions. And if there are individual level data, not shocker for this conversation, that data could be connected with other data sets. So a question we often get is, why should we care about student data? Obviously, consumers care, students want to know, and their parents certainly want to know, you know, is this college degree going to deliver what its promise has told for my students and for our kids? And in a world of increasing tuition and increasing competitiveness, I mean, there are all sorts of choices for where students should spend their higher education dollars. And I think there's a lot of demand on the consumer end to figure out what sort of services the higher education system is delivering. There's also wide variation across programs of study. So not only 2-year versus 4-year, but, you know, a biology major versus a computer science major versus an engineering major versus a liberal arts major. You know, what you study really matters as much as where you go, if not more. So with that context, a quick history of where this conversation has been at the national level. In 2006, George W. Bush's Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings, put out a report related to the future of higher education. And in that report, she called for the creation, you can see the quote right there, of a consumer-friendly information database. As a result, or partially as a result of that report, there was a debate at the federal level over whether this type of database should exist. And some institutions, some privacy advocates, folks from sort of across the spectrum raised huge concerns over the privacy implications of having a higher ed data system. So in 2008, in the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, there was an explicit prohibition on this type of data system. So I was not around for any of that, but when I came over into the Wyden office, this was something that was a very hot topic. I mean, this was 2011, you know, students were graduating into a pretty terrible recession. We saw headlines every day about mounting college debt and was my education worth it? And so Senator Wyden really took a consumer information lens to this issue and wanted to create a consumer tool. So he introduced what we call Know Before You Go 1.0, the first version in 2012 that would create this type of data system. But because of the prohibition on the unit record, what we did is we drafted a bill that essentially linked all of the state data systems to the extent those data systems existed. As a result of the unit record prohibition, many states built data systems. This screen grab shows, you know, sort of the lay of the land right now, but the bill basically would call for states to link their data systems and use interoperability standards. And if an institution resided in a state that did not have a data system, that institution could report to another state or sort of aggregating entity that did. And as a result of that approach, we heard all sorts of outcry from the community that said, well, if we don't trust we certainly don't trust the federal government to collect this type of data, but nor do we trust states. And in fact, in many cases, states are even worse. This is 50 opportunities for data breaches, you know, 50 separate systems, and it's extremely inefficient. So folks in the community said, maybe it is time to actually look at the student unit record ban. And so Senators Wyden, Rubio, and Warner introduced a bill that created an exception. It did not repeal the unit record prohibition, but it created an exception for the purposes of this type of a data system. 2015, we introduced a very similar version of that bill, just some small changes. And then the world sort of changed in 2016, at least from Senator Wyden's perspective. I mean, he has been a huge privacy advocate for his entire career. And we started seeing headlines every day about data system breaches. There was the OPM hack. ACLU declared opposition to a student unit record system. We heard conversations on the campaign trail about the creation of a Muslim registry and a Muslim ban. And that obviously raised serious concerns about what types of data the federal government was collecting and how could it be used against American citizens. Equifax breach. At the same time, we started hearing more and more about privacy enhancing technologies. You can see a few examples on the page of the same examples the BU team talked about, but we started hearing about these small deployments, you know, the Danish sugar beet auction, the Estonian government, the BU example, and we met with folks in the national intelligence community and the defense community at their research arms who had invested millions and millions of dollars into these technologies and, you know, really wanted to talk about them, really wanted to brag about them, had some exciting stories to tell. At the same time, there was also a commission on evidence-based policymaking that Senator Murray in the Senate and Paul Ryan in the House had commissioned, and they were having public hearings on how to bring evidence into the national conversation around policymaking at the agency level and at the congressional level. And one of the things that I heard came up over and over again in the context of the commission's deliberations was the student unit record. So given what we were learning in the Wyden office and the senator's interest in privacy and encryption, Senator Wyden sent a letter to the commission saying, hey, there's all these cool technologies we're hearing about. We really hope you consider them. Various experts provided testimony to the commission discussing these evidence-based privacy-enhancing technologies. And so Senator Wyden sent a letter saying, you should take this seriously. We hope you consider these technologies in your final report. So the final report came out, I believe, in September of last year, and in fact included a whole page on emerging approaches that enhance privacy protections. You can see differential privacy, secure multi-party computation, synthetic data. So really gave a nod to, you know, these technologies are real and they're promising, and Congress and the federal government should be looking at them even more than they already are. So with sort of that legitimacy, for lack of a better term, the 2017 version of the Student Right to Know Before You Go Act, which we call version 4.0, included an explicit mandate that a data system be created at the Department of Education that used privacy-enhancing technologies such as secure multi-party computation. It didn't explicitly mandate multi-party computation, but it sort of outlined what MPC does and said technologies such as MPC or other technologies that ensure at least the same privacy protections must be used. And it required institutions to report using MPC, or if they did not want to use MPC, again, they could use a third-party conduit that was able to use that technology. And similarly, a Social Security agency, IRS, Veteran Affairs, the student loan data system at the Department of Education would all essentially report their components of this higher ed data system. So things like, you know, Pell students, or were students veteran recipients, obviously earnings data information, all of those would sort of be inputted to a MPC system with every party contributing being required to use multi-party computation or something, again, that offers the same level of protections, with the Department of Education and specifically the Commissioner for Education Statistics sort of overseeing the system and making sure all contributing parties understood how to do this. So I know I sort of sped through that. The conversation is definitely going on actively at the federal level right now. Both the Help Committee and Education and Workforce Committees are having hearings on data issues. The House Republicans introduced a higher ed reauthorization bill. It's a partisan bill at this point. I know that the Help Committee is actively discussing a HGA reauthorization, and data sort of lays at the heart of this. You know, if there's no data, it's really hard to make the tough policy decisions that, you know, come from the data. So it's an active conversation. It's been an active conversation for some time, but certainly ramping up again right now. And this is what we like to say in our office. Maybe we can have our cake and eat it too. So with that, I'll turn it back over. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I might have to steal that last slide from you for future presentations. I like that. So a quick question for you, Laura. I've heard it expressed by several people, particularly in the higher ed community, that question whether the approach, the technological approach that's included in the latest Wyden-Rubio bill is actually ready for prime time, and are wondering if it might be better to start with like a demo project or a pilot project. Is that kind of option being considered?
Sure. So, you know, when you introduce a bill, you always want to introduce something that's the flashiest possible, right? You know, why start with the demonstration program if you have a history on introducing legislation calling for the whole shebang? So absolutely interested in a demo project and have been having conversations along those lines with several stakeholders. But what I would say is one of the things that has prevented the data conversation from moving forward is the fact that the privacy experts and civil liberties communities have said there shall not be a data system like that. You know, the data system that a unit record approach would create is at risk of a variety of liabilities. And so, while absolutely, I think HGA reauthorization is a ways away. So now would be a great time to do more demos. But there's sort of I don't want to say a feud, but there are differing opinions as to whether we should have a demo project while at the same time creating a unit record system not using multi-party computation. And I think that approach doesn't give the privacy community and the civil liberties community what they have been pushing for, which is, you know, data security and privacy protection. So I think some folks want a both and conversation and some want an either or conversation. And in some ways, those approaches are diametrically opposed.
Great, thanks. So we have a number of great questions in here. So I'm going to start kind of going through some of these. I'm going to rely on Amelia to let me know when we need to wrap things up, because we could go all day with the questions that we've got. So one of the attendees put in a question about data quality, and I think data quality is a big question. I'll address this to the BU team. I think MPC is very promising for data sharing, particularly between administrative agencies, where there are prohibitions against disclosing the underlying PII that have been collected for various program purposes. But one of the challenges that agencies face, and particularly statistical agencies face when trying to link with administrative records, are the data quality issues and the lack of a true individual identifier. They have to rely on probabilistic linkage and then analyze linkage rates. How viable do you think MPC is when you have to question the underlying certainty of the linkage, and you need to be able to perform analysis of your linkage failures?
So, as we mentioned, whatever process you might use to resolve those issues now, assuming that you did not have anything encumbering you from sharing or viewing all the data in the clear, you can implement those in an automated fashion and run them under MPC. So if you can come up with a workflow that makes a decision about whether or not the data has sufficient quality, or maybe perhaps that does transformations to the data based on the quality, or filters out the data, or even does an analysis to determine whether or not the data will be of sufficient quality to make conclusions. All of these things can be, as long as you can automate them and write them as an algorithm, you can run under MPC and get the result. But it is certainly true that it is a challenge to do data harmonization when you don't have access to the actual data. I think that our own recommendation in this context is basically that MPC will allow you to ask more questions without revealing that data, which will effectively reduce the amount of data disclosure and sharing that needs to happen for you to decide what you want to do and how you want to do it. So that's how we would represent it. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment. Yep. No. Yep. That's.
Okay, thanks. So another one. Again, for the BU team, you discussed how MPC moves us away from the trusted third-party approach to data sharing, and instead you just have to rely on, as long as you can trust one of the computers, one of the parties, that you're okay. What if you can't trust any of them? What are your options then?
So it's a very good question. The importance is that you only have to trust one computing party. There is no upper bound as to the number of computing parties necessary. I mean, as long as you're willing to take on the effort required to be one of the computing parties, if you don't trust anyone who's currently in the set, you can join it yourself. You can become another computing party. Therefore, since you trust yourself, you trust one of the N computing parties by definition, and therefore everything is fine against you. And moreover, it does not harm anybody else's sense of trust in the system, because whether they trust you or not, as long as they already had someone else within the set of computing parties that they found trustworthy, they're all still safe. So it's somewhat paradoxical, but somehow the more computing parties you have, the safer you are, because you only have to trust one of them.
Great. So I'll open this question up to all of you. So we heard from Laura the challenges with education data right now, and we know that the BU team especially has put together some great demonstrations of the potential for MPC. What do you think is a realistic time horizon for implementing MPC as a real and viable solution to the higher ed data problems that Laura was speaking about?
So this is Laura. I'll just really quickly, I think a lot of it depends on to what extent the community embraces this technology, right? I mean, we can see, the BU team is not that big. And they have done miraculous things with a pretty small team. And I think one of the challenges is to what extent are resources and attention being poured into this conversation to sort of get the ball rolling and make it real. To the extent this technology is resisted, you know, of course it will be slow in adoption, but what we hear from you know, folks that work in this space is this is not far away from deployment with appropriate resources and buy-in.
This is Andrei from BU. I will add that I think the biggest cost of introducing MPC into any of the infrastructures that are used by government agencies or other large organizations or industry groups and so on are actually not associated with MPC, but just associated with the introduction of any new workflow or application into the process. So it wouldn't be any more costly, you know, overall than introducing a new kind of analysis or a new kind of workflow or a new kind of, you know, database engine or whatever, what have you. I think the biggest cost is going to be the introduction of something new, not specifically the fact that it's MPC. But other than that, we would echo what Laura is saying. You know, if certainly for pilot projects that involve small data and not a lot of integration with existing infrastructure, those are probably possible today or, you know, this year. If we're talking about integrating with existing infrastructures and doing larger data sets, then we're talking, you know, a few years, a few to several years before that becomes, you know, widespread and possible to deploy ubiquitously.
Great. So one of the other technologies that's frequently discussed as kind of one of the potential kind of privacy enhancing technologies of the future is an increasing reliance on synthetic data and simulated data. So one of the questions that got submitted here is, could MPC be used to create synthetic data, synthetic individual level data that could be provided as public use files to researchers?
So yes, as I said, any computation that you can write down as a program, you can run under MPC. Presumably, if you're creating synthetic data, you would like it to have properties, distributions, and so on that reflect the actual data. And MPC would allow you to do that. It would basically involve defining an MPC computation that looks at the real data, again, under MPC, so no one has to reveal it or share it, and generates, again, under MPC, some kind of synthetic data set that has the same properties as the original data. So it is possible.
This is Frederick from Boston University. I just wanted to add to that while theoretically possible, you know, there could be a different workflow. For example, if there's only one organization that holds the data and we want to create a synthetic data set based on that, you know, there are many workflows possible where the algorithm is run behind the firewall and someone would manually inspect the data to make sure that it doesn't leak any information and then it's shipped back to the community. That would not involve the, you know, overhead basically of doing everything under MPC. So we don't want to, you know, this is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Theoretically, it could be, but, you know, you might be running your computation for the next couple of years if it is something that's really complicated. So we do want to emphasize that this should be seen as a collection of potential tools to solve the privacy problem.
Yeah, certainly you should not use MPC if you don't need to. If you can find a simpler solution, we would advocate using that. I will briefly comment also that if you want to create synthetic data sets that are a combination of data sets from different sources, MPC allows that, whereas currently you basically can't do that. You would need to analyze the data sets individually and collectively to get some kind of property that is only visible when you analyze them collectively. But with MPC, you can create a synthetic data set that incorporates several data sources, and you have sort of a synthetic version of those in conjunction with one another.
Okay, and I know we're at 4 o'clock, so if people have to drop off, we totally understand, but I'm going to try to sneak a couple more questions in so that we can get to more of what people were asking here. So we got an interesting one here, and that's, would it be possible to implement MPC, or to have those who want to use MPC to link and analyze their data, do so across a blockchain? And if so, what would that kind of implementation look like?
Sure, I'll take that one. So it is possible. I think I don't know what such an implementation would look like specifically, but maybe what would help is to contrast MPC with cryptocurrencies and blockchains and that kind of technology. What cryptocurrencies are trying to solve is similar to the kind of thing that MPC is trying to solve, sort of get an aggregate cohesive picture of the world based on individual inputs, private decision making. When you build something for a currency, though, it has to survive even against, a lot of the competing parties trying actively to thwart its will. Because if it's money, once money is involved, if you can make a change that comes to your profit, then you will do it. MPC is trying to solve this problem under not necessarily quite as strong of a threat model, that the participants do have some trust in the computing parties. As a result, MPC does not require nearly the massive computing power that cryptocurrencies and blockchains have, where those use, entire power plants worth of electricity in order to achieve the consensus mechanisms that they have. MPC is much, much simpler by contrast, and allows you to compute way more. Whereas cryptocurrencies are mostly for recording data transactions, not so much for for computing over data. So by comparison, MPC is much simpler, though it doesn't address the sophistication of a threat that you would need to address if you're dealing with a currency. But if you wanted to store the results of an MPC computation on a blockchain or any other kind of database, whether distributed or not, you certainly can, and you can pull back from that. We have, in-house, some of our own software can pull from other, not blockchains, but other kinds of databases that you can pull from a database to do MPC computation and stick the results back into it. You can certainly integrate that into your workflow just fine.
Great, and so now I'm going to ask one last question of all of you. So we've heard today there's a lot of potential here. I think MPC has shown tremendous use, particularly in future implementations. I know there's a number of policymakers that are listening today and watching today. What recommendations or what suggestions would you make to them? And I'll address this to all of you. If we want to move MPC forward, like if we want to help bring this to prime time for federal agencies, for institutions and organizations.
So this is Laura. I think one thing I have learned in this experience is the folks at BU, the others that are working in this space are so excited to talk to policymakers about their work. They're so proud of it. It's been a long time coming. They've been working on this stuff for a decade, really, and now people are paying attention. So I think utilize them. One of the things that I enjoy doing is I work in healthcare a little bit too, and just thinking about all of these thorny policy questions that we've always been stuck in this data versus privacy sort of standoff, and neither side will budge. And, I creatively talk to these guys about, here are the ideas I have, here are the thorny public policy issues, and they get really into it. I mean, they start thinking about, how would we create a system like that? And so I think one of the things that's important is to just utilize the world of folks that are working in this space in all of the policy issues and policy areas that we're working on, and look at the demos out there that already exist, because they're pretty cool.
This is Andrei from BU. One of the things that we experienced when we went out to try and deploy this technology is that we had to spend a lot of time talking to the stakeholders, people at the executive level, people in IT, lawyers, and so on, to actually explain to them what the features and what the trade-offs are in using this technology. But one of the things that we observed is that once someone sees it actually work, you know, they're a lot more interested in it. They see the possibilities. They start thinking about what the ways that it can benefit their organization or their workflows are. So I think the most important thing is to enable pilot projects that demonstrate how it can be used. And I think that it's definitely a good time to do that because the technology is ready for those kinds of pilot projects. As we mentioned, they have to be custom built for now, but there's a lot of people ready to custom build those projects. And I think once those are out there, there's going to be a lot more interest and buy-in, and then we'll really see the technology start to spread.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our presenters today. This was very informative, and I think this is going to be the beginning of a whole bunch of conversations rather than the end of them. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Amelia to close us out, and I want to thank everybody who joined us today.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks from us as well to everyone who joined and our fantastic presenters. We will be sharing the slides and the recording of this to everyone who registered, and we'll also be holding a second part of our De-Identification 201 series this Thursday at noon on differential privacy. So thanks to all of you. Hope you can join us then, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.